To windward, the Coral Sea is that part of the South Pacific Ocean which lies between New Caledonia on the east, the Great Barrier Reef of Queensland on the west, the southeastern end of New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the north, and roughly the parallel of 25 degrees south in the southward. In this whole vast area, which contains some of the most dangerous reefs in the world, there is not one navigation light or any aid to navigation whatever. Much of the sea has never been surveyed, though it is known to abound with reefs and shoals. The abundance of coral reefs gives the sea its name. They exist here by the thousand. Over the southern section, the southeast trade wind blows fresh the year round. For more than half the year it blows home to the New Guinea coast, being disturbed there only by the fitful northwest season from December to March. In this same season, cyclones blow with devastating violence. The storms may also be encountered in April and May and other months. Over the whole of the sea there is a steady set to the west, which is often intensified in the near proximity of the reefs. Many of the reefs cannot be seen until a vessel is almost upon them. They give little or no warning of their closeness. It is of little use to heave to in the dark hours, as the old navigators did, for there is always a fair chance of being set upon a reef while out of control. Some of the reefs do not break except in the heaviest weather, and cannot be seen at all until a vessel is upon them. To add to the already manifold difficulties, the sets are increased in the neighborhood of the reefs by tidal streams setting with the rise and fall of the water, directly on and off these razor-toothed mounds of misfortune. Visibility is by no means always good, and in these waters is much subject to mirage. For many years since the accustomed navigation of these waters has been carried on entirely by steam vessels which keep to set routes. Little has been added to our knowledge of them. In former days they were much sailed by whale ships from American and Australian ports, and by the Queensland blackbirders bound to New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, and the Solomon Islands. It is largely to these indifferent navigators that we owe our knowledge of the reefs, and we know very little. More than half the Coral Sea awaits survey. Many of the dangers that are charted are not known in their true positions. The steamship bound with wheat from Geelong or from Sydney to the Far East can safely keep to a prescribed course which is known from long usage to be free of dangers. But the sailing ship, dependent on the wind and largely at the mercy of the currents, enjoys no such advantage. She cannot choose her way unless bound through the Coral Sea with a fair wind, as I had the good fortune to be on my previous 2 passages. She has to stand into danger, to pass through uncharted waters, to contend with everything that comes. In April and May the skies are often obscured by rain, so that it is frequently impossible to observe the sun by day or the stars by night, and the most accurate and constant fixing of the vessel's position by astronomical observations will not suffice to keep her out of danger. It is of little use to be aware of the ship's position, if such reefs as are known are out of position, and there are more not known. In such waters the square rigged ship must proceed with the utmost caution, and navigation is a nightmare. Here, then, down in the farthest leeward corner of this most dangerous sea, with no circumstance in favor and nothing to aid me, with the set and the wind directly contrary, and my way barred by 1,000 reefs and shoals, with the rigging seriously weakened, and my ship herself but barely escaped from destruction, and perhaps gravely strained, for these things are not at once apparent. Here then was I about to begin the dogged and almost hopeless beat of 1,000 miles to windward, and afterwards the whole of the Pacific to sail across towards Cape Horn. As soon as I got into the open waters of the Coral Sea, after being upon Warry Reef, I perceived at once that the set was against me. Gone entirely were the northwest winds, which had so impeded the ship on her passage toward St. Marais, and in their stead now blew light easterlies. It is always so. Adversity piles upon adversity, yet one must do one's best. There could be no giving in, not ever. Indeed, the relief at being free from the dreadful embrace of the reef was at first so great that navigational difficulties seemed of no great importance. Yet I did not belittle the array of circumstances against me. I tried desperately to make towards the east, somehow, in order to get to windward of the Great Barrier Reef, and as many other reefs as possible, before the southeast trade blew home. The endeavor was vain. We began to lose almost at once. Having regard to the ship's seaworthiness, which after her savage pounding was questionable, I had determined to continue with the voyage and beat out of the Coral Sea, but at the same time I well knew that any serious defects which might have escaped observation would very quickly be shown up under those conditions. If it were really necessary, I would go into Brisbane or Sydney to dry dock. This, however, I had no need to do. The ship was not damaged. I had had 2 good swimmers swim along the keel before leaving Warry Island after coming off the reef. So far as they could see, there was no damage beyond a scratching of the paint from the keel aft, but the ill effects of serious accidents are apt to show long afterwards, and I watched the behavior of the ship carefully during the long beat out of the Coral Sea. On that score, at least, I was spared further worries. She had taken her hammering without a murmur, and had yielded nothing even to that iron-bound reef. I was again devoutly thankful, as I had been in New York, and at sea in many storms, that she belonged to a day when ships were built with pride of construction and of workmanship, when craftsmanship still counted, and good work for the work's own sake was still believed in. No modern vessel of thin steel plates would ever have come unscathed through that hammering on Warry Reef. Since we had so narrowly escaped from that danger, I was determined that I would risk no more. I began to beat day after day with a wary eye on all reefs, carefully holding the vessel as far as possible on the tacks which kept her at the greatest distance from known dangers. But very soon we were among the reefs again, and remained among them. It could not be avoided. The adverse set was my greatest enemy, the unseen, constant drift of the surfaced waters toward the west, bearing me back each day as much as, with great labor, I had made, setting me always back, with neither respite nor change, nor hope of change. This was an enemy with whom there could be no parleying, from whom I could expect no mercy. The wind, even in the trade, sometimes changed. It was never fair, but sometimes hauling to the east, permitted me to stand to the southward on the port tack, or veering to the south, let me make some easting on the starboard tack. The wind gave me chances, and was a clean opponent. I could see what it did, judge its force, and be certain of its direction. but the pernicious and perpetual drift of the surface water, silent and invisible, changed only to accelerate towards the points of greatest danger. The thousand reefs, giving no sign, no indication, permitting no calculation of its probable effect, until the result had come, defying forecast, analysis, and reason, the extent to which these surface drifts, sets, or currents, whichever they may be called, affect the navigation of vessels in the deep sea is little comprehended by the landsman. Fast steamers are able to alter their course by a slight adjustment. They use the same sea lanes so often that they are fully acquainted with the probable strength of the forces arrayed against them. Their actual speed can always be calculated. To them the menace of ocean sets is not so great. Nonetheless, many are still lost annually through this cause. The sailing ship, taking her speed from the wind, very often not able to trace her movements with accuracy by dead reckoning, since both her course and her speeds may vary very much in a brief space of time, continuing for indefinite periods in the open sea without a landfall to check her navigation or the accuracy of her instruments, robbed by gloomy skies of the chance of astronomical observations, and without equipment to receive radio bearings, is at a serious disadvantage. There are few parts of the open ocean entirely devoid of the influence of set. A bottle thrown overboard anywhere will invariably drift to some shore in the course of time. It is only in the eddies of the great currents in such places as the Sargasso Sea that the surface of the sea is comparatively still. Even here there is some movement. The main streams of the ocean currents are tolerably well known, but it would be impossible to compile a wholly accurate chart of the sets, of the movements of all those great bodies of water that are put in motion by more or less permanent winds, and the seas bordering the river-like main currents whose movements can definitely be traced. There is still a vast amount of research and investigation to be done before man's knowledge of the surface movements of the sea is complete. I discovered in the ensuing month a great deal about the sets of the Coral Sea, but I never found one in my favor. Well, the beat was begun, the fight was on. On the one hand, the handicapped ship, on which I could no longer carry a top-gallant sail and a fresh wind, the beautiful little full-rigged ship, whose only advantages were her strength and her superb seaworthiness. On the other hand, the great forces of the mean and callous ocean, concentrated and intensified in the dangerous Coral Sea. All April I was beating. Easter came and went. I was still beating, on and on and on, in stifling heat, through rain, with the drinking water gone, warm in all the tanks, and the pitch bubbling in the seams, with the Cape Horn sails aloft, suffering heavily, and the gear chafing, and for the first time with the open manifestations of a few malcontents on board. As the days passed, the insidious work of calumny and intrigue had begun to have some slight effect. If ever discontent could be expected to spread in a vessel, it would be here under those conditions. So long as we had a clean storm to face, or an open sea voyage to make, with its reasonable proportion of good and bad conditions, the spirit of all on board had been good enough. But this day after day, seemingly endless battle with adversity showed up the weak, the cowardly, and the mean. We have these always with us, but there were occasions when I thought of the ancient practice of marooning and as an enviable and necessary one, a fate more than fit for the spreader of malign evil in a sailing ship at sea. Desirable as it might have been, fully justified and wholly earned, I could not maroon my few misguided malcontents. In these 2 regulated days it is against the law. Indeed, though the attitude of 1 or 2 of the fellows was worrying at time, there never was any active trouble. It seemed to me that I had shipped at various stages odd young gentlemen who were more expert at living upon the bounty of their parents than in anything else, and if they were so, why, this was partly the parents' own fault. Some of them seemed to have been under the delusion that they had embarked upon a joyride, and this the voyage could never be. Life is not like that. There has to be a great difference between disciplined sailing in a properly conducted ship and joyriding. It seems to me the well-disciplined fellows in a ship are usually the well-disciplined and the most self-controlled ashore. The idea that life at sea is a gorgeous holiday is erroneous. The difficulties that come up in ships are much the same as those that come up in any living, but at sea they must be overcome. Navigating the Coral Sea, we were dependent, in the last resort, on our eyes. For this reason, and because the view from high aloft is very much wider than from on deck, I kept a constant lookout posted on the fore topsail yard. The boys in general kept these turns. I found that some of them were taking books aloft to read. It was impossible to see them from the deck, and a boy who must constantly be watched is of no use in a full-rigged ship or anywhere else. There has to be some trust, some loyalty, if not to the ship, at least to shipmates on board. There must be some conception of duty, but it was precisely in this important aspect of communal living that a few of the young Americans proved sadly deficient on this voyage. The idea of disciplined living had not been brought home to them. The discipline even of their minds was slipshod and untrained. To a few of them, to some of the older ones, their bodies existed merely for the beastly gratification of their lusts. The body the temple of the soul, a stepping stone to God. They laughed at any such idea, and no manner of precept, discourse, or example would change them. At sea now, because we saw no reefs, though we beat amongst them, it was my duty to see none, a duty to be performed only by endless effort and unceasing vigilance. They thought there were no reefs. Ah, what the hell! So the lookout read. What in the name of God some of these youths thought they would find at sea, I do not know. It seemed impossible to get into their heads any conception of mutual cooperation for the ship's safety and their own, or any idea of the necessity of doing all things thoroughly and well, both for their own sake and lest they kill you. The price of neglect and lack of vigilance at sea is desperately high. None of them had been called upon to pay that price as yet. I took good care that they should not make me and their shipmates pay it for them. I had told them earlier why a good lookout was so necessary. I tried not to give orders which seemed unnecessary, or the reasons for which were not quite clear. I called all hands and said, perhaps with some fierceness, that I would strike down the first fool who endangered the ship in this or any other way, because I always insisted upon immediate and proper obedience to all orders. I had heard in Samaray that I was another Captain Bligh. I was to hear this kind of thing again in Tahiti, but nobody listened there. Captain Bligh, in the safety of saloons ashore my ship, was reported as a hell ship, I heard. Well, if she had been, she would not have got very far, but without proper discipline she would not have got far either. The Lahau Reef first barred my way. The Lahau at least has the advantage, from the navigator's point of view, of possessing a few low cays which show above the surface, but one has to be very close to see them. To offset this minor advantage, the chart, which here breaks out in a profuse rash of the dotted lines and hieroglyphs, which stand for shoals and reefs, cheerfully records the fact that the western part is unsurveyed. The same remark applies to the Trigros reefs close by. The whole of the way inside the Lahau to the impenetrable wall of the Great Barrier is full of dangers. It was unsafe to stand down into those waters. I went about and headed towards the northeast again, since that was the best I could do. I had to pound out 4 days on the losing tack before I was far enough to windward of the Lahau to try again to weather it. I went about and again could not clear this big reef. Approaching all of these reefs, one must remember that 3 vital factors are working steadily to set the ship towards destruction. The reef being to leeward, the very send of the sea itself, the movement of the waves caused by the wind, as separate and distinct from the whole motion of the surface water, which never stops, is as adverse as the wind. Then there is the tide, unknown here and incalculable, and finally the accelerated current sweeping across the whole sea, which, no matter how the reefs are placed, seems always to set towards them. No, I could take no risks here. I had to keep from the proximity of reefs at all costs. I beat and beat past the How. At last the Marion loomed up, a large ambiguous mass on the chart, but a camouflaged terror on the sea. Heavy breakers keep out of them. Apparently foul. Reef reported by the ship Wonsfell 1864. Read the legends on the chart. Nearer in towards the Great Barrier were more reefs reported by the ship Wonsfell in 1864. Had no one seen them since. I felt inclined to head towards these places and to investigate, at last, these navigational dangers so long unseen. But I resisted the temptation. This is work for powered vessels, financed by governments, with every facility of accurate navigation and unlimited funds at their disposal. I kept away from such places, for I could not be sure even of the course I made, and the days now were filled with rain. I stood away from Marion Reef, though it was said to have anchorage. The inner portion of Marion Reef has numerous coral heads, but has only been partially examined, says the Sailing Directions, Australia Pilot Volume 111, adding that with the sun in a favorable situation, it might safely be approached from the northwest. But I had no sun. I drove the ship under what sail I could carry, in the fresh trade towards Mellish Reef to the eastward. A sand quay here, I read, affords ample space for the encampment of a shipwrecked crew while preparing for a passage to the mainland. This was encouraging. Beyond were the Bampton Reefs, and much dangerous ground not surveyed, and many reports of reefs and shoals and rocks, the positions and even the existence of which the chart admitted to be doubtful. Reef and sandbank, position approximate. Dangerous ground eastward of the line, not surveyed. Shoals ground, Darling 1879, not seen by HMS Lark 1882. Breakers reported, position approximate. The Henry Miller Reef, the Minerva Shoal, the Balana Shoal, the Neros Reef, these scattered their destructive fangs over many miles of the unclean waters, and the positions of none of them had been found with certainty. The bark Henry Miller had a good idea of the reef to which she gave her name, for she stayed on it. So had other vessels, but there are in those waters reefs enough to go around. You may find one for yourself if you are so minded, by the somewhat abrupt and possibly fatal means of inscribing the name of your vessel upon the chart as the finder of the so and so reef, position doubtful. You may achieve some permanence in the printed word. The chart round there has been unaltered for 50 years, as far as I could discover, and is likely to stay that way. Between these abodes of marine fatality, with the Great Barrier upon the one side, and all the maze of the Chesterfields, the Bellenonas, the Boobies, the Avons, the rest on the other, with the vast collection of the Lahowes, the Marions, the Wansfells, the Fredericks, the Kens, and God knows what in between, with round and about all this the waiting multitude of the half-discovered, and everywhere the menace of the unknown. Here I beat, for a month I beat. In the first week I sailed 800 miles, and made 200. In the second week the ship sailed 950 miles, and at the end of that time was perhaps 20 miles nearer to Tahiti. But I had to go on, go on, go on. That is all that one can do, unless to bemoan the circumstances that ill fit a full-rigged ship for windward working. She is good for Cape Horn, unavailing to go back when there is no place to return to but Samaray or Port Moresby, and after that there was no other route towards Tahiti. This was the only way my ship could take. The second mate, partly recovered from his blood poisoning, had long since discovered that the breakdown of the engine was complete and final. In a way I was glad even of that, for it always seemed to me a meanness to have so fine a ship, and to hide in her hold a noisome engine. There were not lacking some who shouted, "Go into Brisbane, go into Bundaberg, go into Maryborough. He can't go on without an engine. He can't make it. Well, be short of water and of food." I went into no ports, and did not run back anywhere. I just held on. But there were times when I felt inclined to fling a curse at Collins Street, and I found it difficult to remember charitably the tooth-sucking swollen gut who had found the gold on Sudeste. I slogged on. At last, after many days of strong wind in which we made nothing, and of calm in which we drifted backwards, there came a chance to drive down the passage between the Saumarez and Swain reefs of the Great Barrier, and get out, or almost out, of the Coral Sea that way. I took the chance. The mariner is cautioned to give the Barrier Reef a wide berth. The recommended track is 200 miles to the east of it, says the cautious pilot. I came within 3 miles, and we heard the sea breaking, but we got through. It was a black night, moonless, with some rain. It blew fresh from the east. We came down between Saumarez and Swain, and I was glad when it was morning. I was then at the end of a hard month's beating, clear of the worst of the Coral Sea, but I was jammed on the coast of Australia. I had still to beat, and beat, back against the wind towards Wreck Reef, where all the islets are strewn with wreckage, for 2 hard days of fresh wind, and then back again, and I could not clear Sandy Cape. I was being set upon the Breaksea Spit, out again to sea. Would this never end? Sometimes it seemed not. I beat a week off Sandy Cape, in fresh and squally weather, with some of the squalls at the force of a moderate gale. I single-reefed the topsails and stood on. The sea had grown big, and the little ship, too short to make good headway, under those conditions, flung herself into it and at it, leaning heavily and driving hard, bucking and staggering and sending the spray over the topsail yards. It rained and blew, and our progress was a wretched travesty of sailing. The next day was worse. and still I held her on, not jammed too closely on the wind, for that would not help, treading down the turbulent seas with her broad old bow and flinging to spray all over her. To windward, it was a long, long cry that stayed with us through many days and many nights, to windward, to windward. One day it was ended. With a let-up in the wind, we cleared Sandy Cape and stood down the coast of Australia, the wind fair for the first time in 31 days. We had made 1,000 miles to windward in a month, and had beat out of the Coral Sea. I took a fresh departure from Cape Byron, and having been in the Pacific Ocean for 6 months, set out now with the whole of its great length still to cross, towards Cape Horn. There were a few things to be thankful for. We had had no more fever, though the same patients still suffered, now and again, and there had been no hint of a cyclone. We had learned in Samaray that the steamer Montoro, a large culler in the New Guinea mail and passenger service, had had to shelter from the blast, the beginnings of which had overtaken us in the Coral Sea. This had been a savage storm. Now at least we were gone from the track of such disturbances. I stood first in the direction of Lord Howe Island to look if I could, without anchoring, and get some potatoes and fresh food. Potatoes had been scarce at Samaray, and it was some time since we had had fresh vegetables. The life of the ship now went on peaceably, the life and the work. The carpenter had long ago shaped the main topgallant mast, and made new traceries for the fore topmast head. He was busy with the iron work and all that was necessary to make permanent and rapid repairs when the chance came. The small ship was a little small to work with the rigging at sea, sending down masts and yards if it was not absolutely necessary. She was never without motion. Even in the calm she rolled, for something of a swell is rarely absent from the sea, and she rose to everything. For the rest, there was constant employment. The rigging of a full-rigged ship provides infinite labor, and there are the sails and all the deck work and the boats. There was never scarcity of work. Part of the day was given up to lessons, navigation mostly, with seamanship once weekly. The boys had the opportunity to splice and sew canvas and engage in the other niceties of the sailors' calling in their daily work. On Saturdays the quarters were cleaned out fore and aft. The New Zealanders, with the exception of one who had left at Samaray to try his fortune, he said, on the New Guinea goldfields, had settled down very well. Every one now was well used to the ship, and all were useful, though perhaps in varying degrees of usefulness. One day I was called upon to draw a tooth, an operation I had secretly long dreaded. I had a fearsome array of dental instruments, forceps, chipping hammers, hypodermic needles, and so forth, and I had a small stock of local anesthetic for injection. I had indeed made it well known about the ship that I had these things, and allowed the view to gain ground, that I delighted in them and wished only to have patience. By this means I knew I should scare off any patients there might be, and for more than a year this subterfuge worked. Not that teeth were neglected, but I had always, until then, patched them up, scraped out the nerve if I could, and filled the cavities temporarily with a mixture of zinc oxide and oil of cloves that set hard. For ordinary toothaches, I had a good supply of palliatives. The proper dental work was always done by qualified dentists in ports. I hoped to contend only with the aches, but now came young Carmichael from South Africa with the port side of his jaw like the mizzen truck, and nothing would satisfy him but that I should take the tooth out. My bluff was called. "It'll hurt," I said, but he was too far gone to mind. He did not even demur when Jim Evans, hastily summoned with Hilgard to act as surgical assistant, suggested in a kindly way that a slight knock on the head with a belaying pen would be a humane preliminary. But the belaying pens were iron, and the effects of a clout with one of them might be permanent. I preferred to try local injections, at least at first. I went ahead, but it appeared soon enough that the strength had gone from my cocaine preparations, from being kept too long at sea. They had no effect at all, though I injected 3 ampules. The tooth to be extracted was an old one broken down to the gum. It was no use trying the usual method of getting a lashing on it and heaving away. There was nothing to grasp. Even with the forceps, it was difficult to get a grip. To play round with the forceps, trying to grip that decayed tooth, and the boy's aching mouth would have been agonizing to him. I decided that the best thing I could do was to apply a little of a general anesthetic and pass him out. I had a supply of this. I had to have it. I passed him out. He acted a little queerly as he went. He seemed to think he was at the wheel, or somewhere, but out he went in time. It seemed a long time, and I got a good swing on the forceps. Yo-ho, heave, and buster. I ground and scrunched in the approved manner to loosen the roots, or in what I hoped was the approved manner. There was a dreadful rending, and she bust all right. The forceps came away, and something with them. The victim came to and rubbed his jaw. The assistants relaxed their grip, drank with the now recovered victim a bottle of brandy, and the 3 departed. I noticed then, looking at the forceps, that I had only half the tooth. The other half I feared was still in his gum. But I said nothing. Somehow, curiously enough, that the ache had departed, and the pain was all gone, but I took good care to see that the boy received proper dental attention at Papeete afterwards. It was only in desperation that I touched the teeth or any other part of the human body. We were 40 days out from Samaré when we came to Lord Howe. We had seen it for 3 days then, and again had to beat. A presumptuous clump of clod-shaped mountain dumped in the ocean. The island was unprepossessing enough seen from sea, but ashore we found it a fine place, a quiet spot of lonely beauty inhabited by a kindly group of Australian whites, for Lord Howe is one of the few inhabitable islands of the South Pacific where, so far as is now known, there never have been natives. The wind had freshened in the middle watch of the night of Sunday the 10th of May, and had hauled a little fair so that I lay off Lord Howe before the dawn, keeping to windward off the northern end of the island, between the Admiralty Islets and Philip Bluff, perhaps 2 miles from the land. Here I backed the main yard and waited for daylight, and at the first glistening of the eastern sky squared away for the southwest roads. I conned from aloft, there is Coral here, said to be its southernmost Pacific limit, and stood carefully towards Goat Island, meaning to stand off and on and not to land, but to get some supplies and be gone as quickly as possible. I had grown weary of coral reefs and I did not want to come near this one, for the southwest roads of Lord Howe are open to most of the ocean's winds, and it was already early winter, but there came some gentlemen from the shore by motorboat to ask if we should like to come ashore to breakfast, and they said the potatoes we needed would have to be dug. So I put the anchor down and stayed, and I was glad. It was an open road, but the wind was offshore, and the conditions were steady. The glass was high, and there was no sea. Pigs, goats, poultry, and vegetables are procurable. Wild pigs and goats are numerous, and fish may be caught in abundance, says the admirable but considerably outdated Pilot, which, being mainly a naval publication, cares little for the passing of time. I announced that we desired these things and would pay for them in hard cash, but the information is quite wrong. The island, instead of being a place of refreshment for odd sailing ships and whalers, has become a gem of the South Seas, a tourist paradise, and the fields where the vegetables once grew are now cleared for tennis courts. The last vessel that had looked in there for provisions, they said, had been a barkentine bound with a cargo of bones from Rockhampton towards New Zealand 28 years ago. The islanders have long since ceased to keep refreshments for ships when no ships come. The whalers have gone, and steamers, proceeding on their brief voyages, can carry all they need from the big ports. In the old days, whalers preferred to refresh at Lord Howe, since if they put in at Australian ports, their crews would desert to the goldfields. The American whalers were accustomed to bring stocks of plows and farming implements and all sorts of things that the settlers needed to barter for their food. I found an old man resident of the island, a fine old man who had been a sailor once himself, who could recall the Hobart Town whalers by their names, though they have been gone 40 years or more, the Flying Childers, Emily Downing, Velocity, Water Witch, and others of the sweet-sounding, smelly wanderers. He had seen 9 whale ships in the bay, standing off and on, he said, with their boats ashore for food. They rarely anchored, having a mistrust of the Lord Howe anchorages. In those days there were goats and pigs and all kinds of produce. Now there is one captive goat, and those that roam the steep foothills of Mounts Gower and Lidgardburg may be hunted only by the islanders. Progress has come even to Lord Howe, and the homes, comfortable and well-planned dwellings, beautifully kept, are now the Pines and Ocean View and the Bungalow, and they cater for holiday makers from New South Wales. The main income of the island is, however, not from this source, but from the proceeds of the sale of the Kentia palm, found here alone in all the world. The islanders tend the palm and market the seed through Sydney, all not directly concerned with the tourist business, which is considerable share in the palm's earnings. Nature is kind to this fair island, not only through its gift of the Kentia, palm, though the appearance of the island from the sea is sullen enough. It is very fertile, here all things might grow, and many do, but the tourist, strange folk, prefer to live upon the contents of refrigerators brought from Sydney. The meat and the fruit come this way, and much of the vegetables. It is progress, I suppose, but I was disappointed. Not that my ship came away empty, for by the goodness of the citizens I was able to get hold of a fine big sheep, a large pig, a bunch of ducks, 7 sacks of potatoes, half a ton of very good bananas, and a good supply of some local vegetable, the name of which I forgot to ask. Here the people, though they no longer till the fields, for passing square-rigged ships they never come, that never come, know how to live. There is no collector of customs, no magistrate, no governor, no mumbo-jumbo. You come, and there you are. You ought, of course, to have practic from Australia. This I still had. The penalty for not having it is doubtless 500, or some such sum, but the islanders will not collect it. Here at last was a place where white people lived at peace and without pretense. There is no chief, no resident, no gaol. A gaol was sent from Sydney once to be erected in sections, but the indignant islanders sent it back with the curt message that such things were more needed in New South Wales. The climate is temperate and the days are almost invariably pleasant. Money is little used, but there are stores if you want them. Fish abound. There is a fine beach for swimming. Mountaineers may try their luck with Lidgebird, which has never yet been climbed. The kentia grows and its seeds are sold, and for little tilling the land gives much. All citizens hold their sections of arable land from the government direct. Lord Howe is under the jurisdiction of New South Wales, and there is neither middleman nor rent. There are no hostelries and no carousels. Behavior is regulated in accordance with the best interests of the whole community, and a status of material equality is reached here more fully than in most white settlements. It sounds ideal, and yet I don't know. I suppose man lives here as much by brotherly love as elsewhere, but one leaves the island with the pleasant reflection that after all, the human being at his best, with the usual load of unnecessary economic cares lifted from him, desires to be a decent and friendly animal. They gave us newspapers fresh from Sydney, and I saw that Europe seemed determined on a new war, or a continuance of the old at the earliest possible moment. Perhaps a few dictators ought to be banished to Lord Howe. I ate a glorious breakfast ashore that lasted me for the next 3 days. A grand feed of bananas and cream and fried eggs and fish, with crisp white toast and coffee and all the trimmings, and I gazed round me benignly. This was a good island. In the afternoon the islanders came out to the ship, lying at anchor with her sails clewed up and ready to be set, and in the evening with the pig and the sheep and all those things, I hove up and departed, going under easy sail. I did not wish to set too much until we were well clear of Gower Mountain, a great woolpack rock that stands 4 square to the west winds, and belches its own squalls. Square Gower is a monstrous berg to rise here precipitous from the Pacific Sea, a brooding mass, cliff-sided, flat-topped, a sullen monument to the implacable forces of nature that flung it there. Its great height and immense solidity, beside the island's low and slender length, made distance difficult to judge. We seemed to go with our sails in its very shadow, to head towards it dangerously before the backed head-yards canted the ship's head seawards and away. Yet we were probably never within 4 miles of the mountain. An old whaler, he who remembered the Hobart Wanderers, came out to the ship, and when we put her under sail, he could not contain himself. He stood by the wheel and burst lustily into Shenandoah, sweet haunting sea-song, and looked aloft at the sheeted sails with shining eyes and an expression like that of a musician, long deaf, suddenly hearing great music again. A mariner of old seeing once again a beautiful ship of a type now nearly lost to the world, seeing her in the glory of her sails at evening with a mountain behind, and a long beach and the breakers on the reef flying high, seeing her and feeling once again the life coming to an anchor free wind ship heading out to sea. He sang, "Long may he sing, old mariner, for his kind is as doomed as his ships, and already almost as rare." So we went away and left the island, and stood to weather the pyramid south of Gower, with the north wind now fresh, and after many days of beating and adversity, I felt once again the joy of being there, and of sailing this lovely ship for my poor ideals.